Thanks for joining us today for this webinar about how commercial asset third-party owned solar systems with Enphase microinverters can qualify for an additional 10% bonus investment tax credit. And what this credit means not just for the asset owners who directly get the tax credit, but also how it can benefit installers, sales agreements for leases or PPAs with TPOs. I do just want to let everyone know we are going to record this webinar and we're going to share a recording with you by email. So if some of your colleagues wanted to attend but couldn't make it, don't worry, you'll be able to share that recording with them. And the slides for today's session are also going to be in the handouts. They already are in the handouts. Feel free to download those and share those with your team as well. My name's Tony Vernetti. I'm a senior trainer here at Enphase Energy. I do training on lots of different topics. I'm here just as the facilitator of today's session, however. The subject matter expert is Chris Couture, who is also, who's got his video on. Thanks for that, Chris. He's a VP at Enphase Energy and head of consumer finance, and he has, I believe, more than 20 years experience just in solar financing, and maybe, I don't want to age you, Chris, but maybe 30 years in finance. So he really knows this topic well. Of course, solar financing in general, but this topic of how to qualify for this 10% adder. I mean, he's been doing training on this a lot recently. So I think this is going to be a really interesting session for everyone attending today. All right, without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic over to Chris.
All right, thank you, Tony, and good day, everybody, from beautiful Austin, Texas, where I'm headquartered. So generally, tax is not a fun topic that anybody wants to talk about, but it is very impactful. But we're going to limit this to 2 slides. So this is going to be a relatively short presentation part of this. We're allowing tons of time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in there. Don't worry, we're not going to get to them. We're going to have tons of time for this. This is not going to be death by PowerPoint, I promise. So let me just start with a little bit of background, just because some of the installation partners we've talked with before have said, look, I don't really even understand what the 10% domestic bonus credit is, much less how to qualify for it. So let me give you a little bit of background. When the IRA was passed a couple of years ago that extended the ITC for all of us, there were various adders that were added, energy community adders, low and middle income adders, and what's called a domestic content adder, which means that companies can get 10% more of the ITC. So instead of getting a normal 30% ITC, they can get another 10%, which means the ITC is worth 40%. So it's pretty impactful, okay? But when the IRA was passed, the guidance around that 10% domestic content bonus credit was really geared toward utility developers or large-scale commercial. The guidance about how residential or even small commercial could receive that benefit really wasn't contemplated that well. That's why there's been this big gap of time between when the IRA and the ITC extension was passed and where we are now on the domestic content guidance for small commercial and residential. So in that period between the IRA being passed and May 16th, which was a big piece of time, that's how long it took for US Treasury to come up with what their updated guidance is. And what is updated guidance? Well, for example, when the IRA first came out, the concept of a microinverter even being considered a component wasn't even contemplated. So therefore, there was no way to say, does your microinverter qualify as domestic content, because a microinverter wasn't even identified as a product that would qualify. So Treasury spent a lot of time putting the guidance together. What we're really happy about is, although they took a lot of time, they got it right. So instead of what the earlier guidance had for utilities and such, which was, okay, tell me what your direct labor cost is, tell me what your direct component cost is, et cetera. They said, okay, we've identified now what all of the components for residential are and small commercial. They've identified not what they're calling a microinverter, but module level power electronics, which is a microinverter. And they've said, here are the components of your product. we want to make sure are domestically manufactured, or what they call substantially transformed, to meet the criteria of domestically manufactured. So what does that mean by substantially transformed? It doesn't mean just assembled in the US. So you're going to see some parties that say, well, assembled in the US or even manufactured in the US, but that doesn't necessarily mean it meets the qualification for ITC purposes to say substantially transformed. And we actually had the Department of Energy come down to our manufacturing plant in Arlington, Texas, and say, you'd be surprised what companies are trying to do. In the wind business, for example, they'll bring in a big turbine. There are some companies that tried to paint it a certain color, send it back out the other end of the floor and say, great, we've substantially transformed it, I want to count. And they're like, no, that doesn't meet the criteria. So there's been a lot of work that's gone into identifying what products qualify, identifying what subcomponents make up that product, and then giving guidance about what that means to substantially transform the product to meet for domestic content. So that's what we're going to talk about here. Is we've been working through all of that stuff with Department of Energy, Department of Treasury, et cetera, and we've all boiled it down to, okay, how does that simplify what you from an installer need to worry about? So that's what we're going to talk about, okay? The other thing that's important for you all to know is that any project that was started after January 1, 2023 and gets started before December 31, 2024 qualifies as long as those projects have 40% of the product that meets domestic content, okay? So there's the window of time, 2023 to 2024, if your projects have equipment and 40% of that equipment meets the domestic content hurdle, you qualify to claim the 10% bonus. So the entire project doesn't have to have domestic content material. 40% of the project, and I'll get to that on the next slide, the way that the point system works. But as long as the combination of inverters, racking, and modules from your various equipment suppliers, if the combination of those meets 40%, your project qualifies for the 10% domestic content bonus, okay? The other thing that was interesting in May when the guidance came out is that projects can receive 40% of the equipment to qualify with just microinverters and racking. So you don't necessarily need modules to reach that 40% threshold. Certainly there's incentive to get people to use modules, because after 2024, that 40% threshold steps up 5% every year over the next 3 years. So projects started in 2025, they have a 45% threshold of domestic content. Projects started in 2026 have a 50% threshold, and projects started 2027 have a 55% threshold. So the idea is there's a ramp to allow the module guys to get domestic content in place, because I think, as we're all aware, there's just not a lot of capacity for cells in the US right now. There's a lot of module assembly going on, but there's not a lot of domestic manufacturing of cells themselves. So that ramp period allows the cell manufacturing to come into play. So what we Enphase are doing in order to help project developers and or TPO owners confirm that they've got 40% product qualified, Enphase is providing a reliance letter, which we'll talk about here on the next slide, that says, we certify that these product SKUs that I'm going to show you meet the domestic content hurdle and meet the domestic content hurdle at this percentage requirement, so you as a developer or you as a customer can claim the 10%. Okay, so this is relative to those of you that do small commercial. Your end customers can get the 10% credit. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to notify your commercial customers saying, hey, Mr. Customer, I'm using products that allow you to claim the extra 10% domestic content bonus. So we would make reliance letters available for you to give to your customer, because it's your customer that's going to claim the credit. For those of you in the residential space that work with TPO providers, it's really the TPO provider that's going to get the extra 10% bonus credit, and they're going to want to know that the equipment that you as the EPC are using is using equipment that allows them to claim that credit. Okay, so we work with all the TPO providers on providing them the same information I'm going to show you, because ultimately we want them to have confidence with their tax equity investors that they can actually claim the 10% credit, so that you as the installer community can figure out how to get benefit of that to yourselves and to your customers. Okay, so with that, Tony, why don't we jump to the money slide? So let's go through the specific Enphase products and the specific domestic content thresholds that allow you as an installer to put projects in place that qualify for that 10% domestic content adder. Okay, so Enphase has products that are going to only be manufactured in the US. And the reason that's important is because what we don't want to create is a situation where certain products are manufactured both in the US and at our overseas products or overseas plants, because we don't want your crews to have to worry about, well, how do I know for this project which particular box I need to pull to put on the roof, because I want to make sure I'm installing the domestic content product, not the product that was necessarily manufactured overseas. How do I know that? So what we've done on the Enphase side is we've identified specific SKUs that are only going to be manufactured in the US. So that SKU for residential is going to be IQ8HC. That SKU is shipping today that meets 17.6% of a project's overall cost threshold. And the reason for that is when the updated guidance came out from Treasury in May, they identified a subcomponent that they call the enclosure, which is really the clamshell on your microinverter, that wasn't contemplated in the original guidance, but they added that in the updated guidance. So when we opened up our US manufacturing plants, we manufactured certain components, substantially transformed certain components, but didn't have the clamshell. Now that we've identified that the clamshell is a required component, according to US Treasury, we're bringing that component onshore. And in September, that exact same product is going to step up and qualify to be 35.6% of a system's overall cost. Okay, so that SKU is IQ8HC. That is our higher power microinverter. And the reason we selected that particular SKU is we want to be able to accommodate a longer roadmap of supporting higher wattage panels. So what we didn't want to do is have people start loading up on a specific SKU and then find out that down the road, that particular microinverter is not going to support the higher wattage panels. So we very specifically chose the HC as our product line because it's going to have a longer runway to support higher wattage panels when they come out. And we want to eliminate the transition churn and potential, obsolescence of domestic product with one SKU as a new one transitions. So any questions about specific SKUs and availability and pricing, talk to your Enphase RSM. They'll be able to have more information on that for you, but I wanted to let you know that it is the HC is the only SKU that's going to have domestic content, but it will only be made in the US. So today that SKU is shipping with 17.6. There are certain racking companies that if their fasteners and their rails are both qualified for domestic content, achieve 25.8%, just the racking on its own. So if you combine our current SKU with a racking company that has fasteners and rails, you can get to 43.4% today. In September, when our SKU jumps up to a 35.6 qualification, you'll have more diversity of racking companies. You can work with racking companies that maybe have only a rail only that qualifies, might not have the fastener. The percentage qualification for rails is 8.6. So the combination of our SKU in September with a rail only company will still clear the 40% threshold. So if you as a developer are using any one of these particular SKUs from Enphase, along with racking provider that either has fastener and rail or rail only, you can get your project to meet that threshold. So I'll jump to commercial in a second, but I'll let you kind of take that in, and then as Tony mentioned, put any questions in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. Okay, let's jump to commercial. Almost the exact same thing for commercial. It's our IQ8 8P 3P SKU. Same concept in that today, anything with a serial number starting with 54, and so for those of you that are commercial developers, you're going to want to check on the serial numbers for those, because again, we got the updated guidance was allowing us to be more clarity on how we're manufacturing this. But the same concept today, our current IQ8P 3P SKU with a 54X serial number has 17.6%. That's what's made in the US. Along with a fastener and rail, 25.8, you get to the same math. In Q4, we're going to have our enclosure manufactured in the US, so we won't have to worry about the serial number segmentation. And you'll have the exact same scenario for commercial that you have for residential. You can use just the Enphase microinverter. You'll have more flexibility on rail, and then you can still achieve the 40% threshold. So that's what you're going to need to be telling your end commercial customers, is showing them how you meet that threshold. And then, like I said, Enphase is going to be providing a reliance letter that says, if you're using one of these two SKUs, we certify that if it's this SKU without the DOM, we'll meet 17.6. If it's our SKU with the DOM, it'll be 35.6. And then you're going to want to ask for a similar reliance letter from either your module manufacturer or your racking company that has what percentage they're going to certify to. You as an installer will put those, manufacturer's reliance letters together, and you'll be able to show that to your customer that says, Mr. Customer, this is how I'm proving to you that I've met the 40% threshold, and you can feel confident claiming that extra 10% bonus credit. Okay. And then lastly, on the storage side, we're doing the exact same thing. We're onshoring our storage product. It'll be the IQ Battery 5P NA DOM SKU, which will be available later in 2024. And that will achieve 45.6% domestic content on its own. Okay, so again, your RSM will have product availability and pricing for these SKUs. And it's as simple as that. There's not a lot of complexity to it. Now, the one thing that I will kind of leave you all, for those of you on the residential side that are saying, well, how do I see the benefit of that extra 10%? Because it's really your TPO partner that's going to get that benefit, which is absolutely true. So what we're encouraging you to do is make sure you communicate with your various TPO partners and give them some feedback, or ask them specifically about how they're going to need you to certify and quantify that what you put on the roof is actually these SKUs and how you're going to benefit from it. So for example, a TPO partner that gets this extra 10%, they may be contemplating keeping some of that for themselves because there's some overhead, and it'll help them with payment processing to installers faster because they'll have more 10%. They may say, I want to use that 10% and buy down my PPA pricing to homeowners because I want to create more native demand in new markets. Or they might say, I'm going to change my redlining to you as an installer to incent you to use these products so they can help take advantage of the 10%. Or they may do a combination of all of the above, because the intent obviously is to take the benefit from the government, that extra 10%, on an overall system which has real benefit, and then use that to help us out in the industry by either driving native demand, by helping you all out with better profitability, or by helping with more cash flow through the process. So we Enphase, we can't dictate how that 10% is used. Our objective as Enphase is to make it easy to claim that benefit and provide as clear instruction as we can on what products to use to claim that benefit, and then how that benefit gets distributed are conversations between you and your TPO partner. And again, it's that simple.
Thank you, Chris. That was an excellent summary. As we expected, we do have several questions. I know some of these things you did cover, but it's nice to kind of review, since this is a new topic for a lot of people. A good question came in from Tom. What is the definition of started? When you're talking about projects that are started within a certain time frame, that can have a few different meanings to solar companies. So what is the actual definition according to the code here?
Yeah, so the concept of started really falls into the idea of your project is being safe harbored under the rules for that year if it's started within that year, right? And the general guidance is you have to have either started from a labor perspective or accrued 5% of the equipment cost within that tax year. So let's say you're working on a commercial project, okay? You would have to have the product procured and paid for 5% of that expense, either in the form of labor spent or equipment spent. So generally, if you hit that 5% threshold, the project is considered safe harbored under the rules for that particular tax year.
Okay, perfect. Question came in from Jake. Will the domestic content requirement only include components manufactured after a certain date? For example, if products were procured prior to the domestic content approval, will these projects still qualify?
Yeah, they still qualify. So if, for example, you've been using IQ8HC anyway, and you've been using racking that meets that percentage, your project retroactively qualifies. So there's no date timeline on when the product was manufactured. It's all based on when the qualified product was actually started to be included in the project, not necessarily when the product itself was manufactured.
Okay, a couple questions came in from Kristen. One's about a specific project, but it is about nonprofits, so I think this might apply to many people on the call today. So her question is basically, how does this apply to nonprofits? Her example is, I have a church that I'm putting a proposal together for, and heard nonprofits can get a direct pay credit card instead of a tax credit. Is this something you're familiar with, Chris?
Yeah, no, exactly. That's a great question, specifically for the commercial market, right? And this is a benefit of the IRA in general, not necessarily of the domestic content bonus adder. But one of the challenges in commercial historically is that if you're not a taxpayer, how do you take a tax credit, right? A tax credit means I'm offsetting my tax bill. So if I owe $100 in taxes and I have a 30% credit, I can take $30 off my tax bill. But if you're a nonprofit, you don't have a tax bill. So historically, nonprofits have been unable to take advantage of the investment tax credit in general. Well, what happened with the IRA is they said, okay, if you're a non-tax paying entity, a nonprofit, a local municipality, instead of taking it as a tax credit, you can get something called direct pay, which is the government will send you a check directly for whatever the same equivalent was of what other commercial entities are writing off as a tax credit. So however the credit is claimed, whether it's a credit off your taxes or if you qualify as a direct pay customer, all of the same adders apply. It's just a question of how you're able to claim the benefit.
Great, thank you, Chris. See, another question from Kristen. With the step up for the threshold, does that mean the extra 10% credit continues through 2027? It's just that a higher percentage of the domestic certification increases?
That's correct. So the adders are tied to the ITC itself. So as long as the base ITC of 30% is in place, the adders are available and in place. It's just the threshold to qualify to claim them is what's increasing.
Got it. Sort of a related question phrased differently from Justin. Well, he says, FYI, ITC domestic content threshold stays at 40%. Only the PTC steps up to 55%.
So admittedly, there is some confusion about what that guidance means. So you're technically reading the guidance correctly. I will tell you that our view has been that there was I'll call it a correction that's going to be made in the specific language, and that the step up is going to be to 45, 50, and 55, just like the PTC. But there have been people that read the language saying, wait a second, there isn't a step up done. But everything we're being told is no, the intent is that the step up is the same, and there'll be an updated clarification on the language. Now, somebody may come out and say, nope, that language was intentional. There's not going to be a step up. So I'm not going to say I'm giving you 100% certainty here. But our advice to you as installers is plan for the step up to be in place, because we believe there's going to be a correction on the language. And don't assume the 40% is going to stay there the whole time. But there is language today that you can be interpreted that said, no, the step up is not going to happen. So it's not an incorrect viewing right now. It's actually a great question. But our guidance is to say, assume there will be a step up, because that's our expectations. There'll be a correction.
Great, thank you. A couple questions about the hardware, fasteners and rails. One person is asking, what is a fastener? Again, this is one of those definition questions. Are we talking about fasteners to the roof or the hardware that attaches the modules to the rails? Could you help clarify that?
Yeah, so great question. For those of you that haven't seen it, what Treasury put out is there's a table that says, here's what racking is, and we think racking is composed of rails, fasteners, and what they call production. Production is labor, okay? On a microinverter, for example, they said a microinverter is composed of a printed circuit board assembly, electrical parts, enclosure, and production. But there's no specific definition for each one of those line items. All I've identified is kind of the subcomponents as a descriptor without a definition. And what they're leaving it to is they're leaving it to the equipment manufacturers to say, if you believe your product meets the intent of what we're describing as a printed circuit board assembly, as electrical parts, as an enclosure, etc., you kind of have to self-proclaim or self-declare that you meet that. So I can't tell you, and neither can the Department of Energy or the Department of Treasury or anybody else, what exactly a fastener is or what exactly a rail is. It's up to your racking company to say, based on our product manufacturing and based on how we're defining fasteners and rails, we think we meet it. So that's why this concept of a reliance letter is really important, because we don't want to leave it to you as the installer to determine whether you're using fasteners or whether you're using rails. We want you to go back to your equipment manufacturer like Enphase and say, can you give me a reliance letter, so that you're the one standing behind what the definition of that is. We're at least from our end, from an Enphase perspective, trying to take all that confusion out. And we've been working with the racking companies as well, trying to give a similar format of a reliance letter. So I can tell you that we've been working with all of the racking companies. We're trying to say, let's provide consistency of what these reliance letters look like. But Enphase can't tell you which racking companies are going to define fastener and rail any particular way. Sorry, that's kind of a tap dance answer, but that's about the best I can do.
I thought it was an excellent answer. So that obviously begs the question, Chris, can we tell people which racking companies are manufacturing equipment that does qualify, or are we steering away from mentioning brands today?
Well, we work with all brands, so I'm not gonna try and promote one or another. They've all said they have a path to get to 25.8. Right? So whether it's Unirack or Iron Ridge or Panel Claw or pick your favorite racking company, they all have plans to get there. What I can tell you is, at least today, Unirack is the one that we've seen is coming out with a reliance letter at 25.8. The other folks are working on it. I don't know where they're at in terms of having a reliance letter on their various components. So we're not afraid to do that, but it's clearly their reliance letter. And I can tell you that the folks at Unirack have been a little more aggressive on saying, we'll tell you that we're going to put 25.8 in a reliance letter. The other folks may be there on the same time period. I just haven't seen their particular reliance letters yet.
Perfect, thank you. Several people asked what a TPO partner is. This is industry lingo that maybe not everyone uses on a regular basis. TPO just means third party owned. A leased system, when a homeowner leases a system or has a power purchase agreement, that system is owned by the TPO and they have a financial arrangement with the homeowner. That's basically what it means. So since a commercial entity owns the system, that's why they can qualify for this 10% adder.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, Tony. So these adders are only available to commercial customers. So a commercial customer takes two forms. Certainly in the commercial space, a commercial customer is the customer, right? That's pretty straightforward. In the residential space, a commercial customer is a commercial entity that owns the asset. Mm-hmm. So part of the entire reason that leases and PPAs were developed was to allow a commercial entity to own the asset and then lease it or sell the power from that asset to the residential homeowner. Unfortunately, one of, I think, is a kind of a flaw, if you will, in the tax guidance, is that an individual residential customer can't claim the 10% themselves. If you're a cash or you're a loan customer, you can still only claim the 30% ITC. Cash and loan residential customers cannot claim the domestic content adder. So it's only if you have a lease or TPO provider, third-party owner, and if they're the ones getting that 10%, that's why you have to talk with them about how are they going to share that benefit with you in order to take advantage of it, because they're the asset owner who can claim it.
All right, several people asked what they wanted to know some of the technical specs of the IQ8HC. There are designers out there thinking, okay, what modules can I pair with this? The peak output of the HC is 384 VA, and I was just doing a quick calculation. So we would normally say that we could pair that microinverter with modules up to around 500 watts. That's about a 1.3 to 1 DC to AC ratio, and still have a really high performance system with little to no power clipping, as it's referred to sometimes. Depending on the orientation of the modules, if they're not perhaps facing due south with a perfect tilt, you could even get away with a higher ratio and go to maybe 510, 520 watts on the module side, that is. Somebody asked if there's any, are there any implications related to what the rail is made out of? Does it simply have to be US made, or does it matter if it's made out of steel versus aluminum?
Yeah, great question. I'm not going to be qualified to answer that, right? There certainly are some requirements about aluminum versus US steel. And that's actually the primary requirement, because it's substantial transformation, which is kind of our requirement on the microinverter side. On other components, substantial transformation may be using US made subcomponents, right? And so if your subcomponent is US steel or US aluminum, you don't have to worry about the substantial transformation component. So it's a great question. And again, each one of the racking people is going to have to kind of self-proclaim how they're reading that versus steel versus aluminum. But yeah, that is a component of it for sure, specifically as it relates to not only the racking companies, but some of the module folks. Because on the module, they look at, there's certain percentages for was your cell made in the US, but there's also certain percentages for what is your glass, what is your back panel, right? What is your framing around the module, right? Is that steel or is that aluminum? So great question, and I'm going to defer that to your favorite racking company to interpret how they're reading the statute themselves.
Another question sort of in that vein about railless racking systems. Do we know of any rail or manufacturers of railless systems that whose equipment can qualify?
Yeah, so great question. I'm going to answer it a little bit different in that every major product component, if they don't have a subcomponent that's listed, then you basically get to say, yes, I meet the criteria, right? At a high level, right? So if there's a requirement that you have to have this subcomponent and an OEM says, but I don't use that subcomponent, everything is into one of my other components, then you get to say, yes, I qualify, right? Because you've essentially achieved that threshold by achieving the domestic content hurdle in whatever other subcomponent or whatever other component of your system is done, right? So we Enphase, we actually have one of those items in our own microinverter, because since we put everything on the printed circuit board, we don't have a separate section for electrical parts. For those of you that read the table the US Treasury's put out, there's a section for electrical parts, where all of the other electrical parts are on our printed circuit board. So we have that same interpretation from an Enphase perspective, and the racking folks that have, railless racking will either say, well, we market it as railless, we technically do have a rail, so we qualify, or they'll say, no, it all is in the fastener and we're going to claim it all that way. So again, talk to your favorite racking company, but that's generally the way the interpretation goes, is if your product itself doesn't contain that subcomponent, you get to claim that you meet it because you've integrated into other subcomponents of your product line.
Okay, great. Question from Kristen, are there currently no commercial SKUs for microinverters that meet the domestic content? I see one says July 24, the other Q4 2024. What is our guidance on what they should quote on a proposal today with an install actually months down the road to ensure it would qualify?
So you're going to want to make sure that you're using the SKUs on this screen in order to qualify. So if you haven't procured the product yet for commercial projects, if you start procuring it today, right, then you'll have that 17.6. If your project is really farther down the road and you say, I don't need to take delivery on it until later on in Q4, you're probably going to want to wait and order the DOM SKU.
All right, question from Jason. Did the IRS and DOE state that they would accept the reliance letter in lieu of the complete documentation?
Yeah, so complete documentation is what the system owner needs to have when they claim the credit. Okay, so I'm a system owner. I'm the one filing a tax return. On my tax return, I'm claiming a 10% domestic content credit. So I, as the system owner, need to have documentation in case I get audited. So it's not something you need to provide with your tax returns per se. It's something you need to be prepared for. If you claim the credit and you get audited, you better be able to back it up. So as the system owner, you need to have your documentation package. And because you as the system owner need to meet the 40% hurdle on the entire system, your internal support is going to be a reliance letter from Enphase, a reliance letter from a racking company, a reliance letter from a module company, etc. You put that together, and kind of that's your supporting documentation to say, here's how the system itself qualifies.
Okay. Let's see. It's got a lot of good questions here. I'm just trying to filter through the ones that we've kind of already answered.
Just to that last question, not sure if this is where it was coming from, but prior to May 16th, the guidance was all about justifying your cost stack. So you as the developer had to have a whole package put together that supported what your costs were. And so therefore you needed documentation from each of your equipment manufacturers of what was the cost component of everything. That's what went into kind of a complete package. You could still do that. The guidance allows you to use either the cost method or this percentage method. Everybody we're talking to is going to this percentage methods because it's so much easier to document. You don't need to put a package together that says, how do I document that the labor was in the US and what was the manufacturer's cost versus the price I paid for it, etc. So if that prior question was related to putting together a package related to cost components, what I'm describing to you here assumes there's no cost analysis done. It's a checkbox that says if this component was manufactured in the US, you get this many percentage points to qualify.
All right. So just a real general question about how that, how the dollar amount is calculated. The question is it 40% of the equipment costs or 40% of the total system installation cost, including labor, margin, et cetera?
You know what might be good, Tony? Maybe if I share the document itself with the point structure, that might be clear. Is there a way I can take over and share my screen?
You want to share the screen? Yeah. It'll just take a second. I'll make you the presenter here.
Yeah, why don't we do that?
All right, you can go ahead and share now.
Okay, so this is the actual notice that was released on May 16th. Okay, so they have these tables put together. And so for a PV module, for example, these are all of the components that they identified that should be part of a module. And here's the relative percentage points that are given to you for each one of these components, okay? You'll see that for an inverter, this is the column we're in here right here, rooftop module level power electronics. If you use an inverter that has a printed circuit board that is domestically manufactured, you get 16 points. If your electrical parts are in the US, you get 1.6. We don't have climate control and module level power of electronics. That's not something. So you see the guidance is don't worry about that. You don't need that. That's not Enphase saying it. That's the guidance. And if you have the enclosure, you get that. And if you get the enclosure, meaning you meet all of the components, then you get to claim all the labor, right? If you can see it on the bottom of my screen. So these percentages are what gets used against the entire total system price to the customer. So if the price to the customer is $100, right, you would get to claim the 10% bonus credit on the entire $100 as long as your percentage points equal 40%. That's the way it works. So you don't need to worry about what price am I charging to the customer, how much was my cost, etc. As long as the components you use meet 40%, then you get to claim the 10% credit on the entire system price to the customer or the price to the taxpayer. Whatever the price the taxpayer paid for the system, that's the price they're claiming. Okay?
Okay. I'm glad we clarified that, because I just kind of realized now that we're using that number 40% in two different ways, as a 40% domestic content, as well as 40% total tax credit.
Yeah. So great question, right? Because the 30% ITC, the 30% ITC with the 10% adder gets you a 40% tax credit, but you only get that 10% adder if you get 40% of your system components to add up. So yeah, thanks, Tony. That's a good clarification.
Okay, let's see.
And then just to, as long as I have this up, to the question about steel or iron production, you can see where there's some confusion on here. This is the table about trackers, right, for utility or large scale commercial, right? Do you have to have if it's non-steel, so if it's aluminum or not, right? You can see what they're doing for wind, and you can see where the battery is. So basically, the guidance has come out to say, here are the components, here are the subcomponents, but then again, each manufacturer needs to claim what is their definition of this subcomponent and do they meet it or not. Okay, so that's why we encourage you to talk to every one of your equipment manufacturers to say, do you have a reliance letter that says what are you standing behind for these percentages? Because we don't want you as the installer to say, well, I know my equipment manufacturer made this component in the US, so I'm going to go ahead and claim these percentages. No, don't do that. Right? There's no definitive definition of that you can rely on. So let your equipment manufacturer give you a reliance letter of what they're standing behind.
Good advice. A lot of people have asked actually for a copy of this, or if there's a link where they can download this. Perhaps you could drop that in the chat with me and I can share it with the group. If you don't get it today, folks, don't worry. I'll make sure that this is either included in, or a link to it's included in a follow-up email that you get within a day.
Yeah, so I have the entire PDF, obviously, so we'll make that available to you.
Okay, great. Question about the battery percentage of 45.6. Do we expect that to increase in the future?
So we're contemplating that. So right now, the way that to claim the credit on storage is the guidance says your PV needs to qualify at 40% and your storage product needs to qualify at 40% separately. You don't get to put the two together. So you can't say, hey, I've got a PV system that has 0% qualified, but I've got a battery on it, so therefore my entire PV plus storage system qualifies. They don't do it that way. In the guidance, there's a ratio that says for certain sizes of PV systems, you have to have at least this much of a storage system, and then therefore you can quantify that percentage against the math. And it'll be in that PDF document that we give you. So there is some translation of size that needs to take place. But we are, from an Enphase perspective, right, what we don't do today is we don't manufacture cells or cell packs in the US, but we are constantly looking at that to say, okay, if there's an economic benefit to having a higher percentage of our storage products above the 45% we have now, and if that helps our installers and helps our commercial customers and the economics of onshoring that makes sense, we are looking at that. I don't have a specific date or a commitment for that I can tell you at this time, but I can tell you it is actively on our roadmap of things we're looking at.
Is there a maximum credit that a commercial asset owner can receive?
Yeah, so if you look at the 30% base ITC, the bonus adders, and that's what they're called, are 10% bonus adders. There's a 10% bonus adder if you're a customer in an energy community. There's a 10% bonus adder if you meet the low and middle income standards as a customer. And there's a 10% bonus adder if you use domestic content. So you could get up to a 60% tax credit. It's all technically the investment tax credit, the base 30% plus adders, if you have a project with domestic content in an energy community to a low and middle income customer that qualifies, right? So those are all the things that the asset owner will have to consider when they file the amount of credit that they're claiming on their tax.
And just to make sure we're answering their question, is there any dollar value hard limit? It's strictly based on percent of the cost, right?
Strictly based on percent of the cost.
Okay, That's what I thought.
Now, I will caution, for those of you that have been around a long time and were in the old tax grant days in 2012, 2013, there were some people that were claiming their fair market values were, $8 or $9 a watt, so that the equivalent 30% meant a lot of dollars. So although there isn't a technically capped dollar amount, I will tell you that one of the things that is being audited most anything is, well, what are you using for dollar per watt, and are you basically outside of the bounds for that? Okay, so just make sure you're not artificially inflating your system costs so much that the relative tax percentage from a dollar perspective looks out of whack.
So a couple questions about other microinverters, Chris. For example, the IQ8 Plus, which is a very popular model and is made in our South Carolina plant. Why is that not part of this?
Yeah, so two reasons. One is what we're talking about is products we can only make in the US, right? And because of the popular product, it's popular in a lot of places all over the globe. So we're not only going to make those products in the US. And then, like I said, specifically with HC, and Tony went through this when he said, okay, what's the conversion to what kind of wattage you can get on your modules? The HC gives us the longest roadmap for basically US demand for the types of products that we have in those markets. So that's the reason for it. And we would encourage you, at least I would, to get with your RSM. And what we're looking for are demand signals, right? So as we've talked about publicly, we have capacity for about 5 million micros in the US every year, right? Well, if we have 100% of that demand for domestic content SKUs, then that's what we're going to do. If we have much smaller demand for domestic content SKUs and people are looking for SKUs for cash and loan systems that maybe have a lower price point, then we're still going to manufacture those SKUs in the US. So, obviously we're going to learn based on what the market is demanding and what we decide to manufacture, but we're starting with the HC, and based on demand, we may only do the HC, or we may get enough demand signals that says, you know what, it's worth doing another SKU. But what we didn't want to do is have people safe harbor equipment to meet certain things and find out that equipment they safe harbored was essentially obsolete. So that's why we picked the HC.
Okay, interesting question about expansion systems, because this is something we're also doing a lot of training on, and especially for Californians who want to add on to existing systems. Sorry, I had the question, then I just lost it here. I think I deleted it. I think the question basically was, Chris, if there's a customer already has a system with IQ8 Plus, for example, not qualifying for this bonus tax credit, and they install a battery that does qualify later, according to the timeline that you mentioned earlier, would they be able to claim the bonus tax credit on just the battery?
Yeah, so let me answer this in two parts. So the short answer on the battery is yes. One of the benefits of the IRA is now battery systems standalone can claim the credit. Prior to the IRA extension, the battery had to be combined with a PV system. So standalone storage does now qualify. And so if you use our domestic content battery SKU, that will allow you to qualify the battery project, and the non-domestic PV that's already on the roof, you're only using that for sizing purposes to say, okay, well, how big does the storage system need to be to qualify? But the short answer is yes, standalone battery systems qualify for the 30% ITC, and if you use our domestic content SKU, they will get the adder on top of that.
All right, perfect.
But while we're on that, we have been asked about, well, what about expansions to existing PV only systems? There has been guidance by Treasury that says, look, you can't just modify a system and claim another 10% ITC for those modifications. Generally, it needs to be treated as a new system or substantially a new system and not just a continued enhancement. And there's no defined interpretation of that, but the guidance we've gotten from the government is if it has a separate monitoring system, it's considered a new system and not an add-on. Okay, so think of an add-on with a second Envoy, for example.
Okay, question about SolarGraph. For commercial, will a SolarGraph proposal show the extra 10% for both lease and purchase option? Do you happen to know if it's like a toggle that they can turn on in SolarGraph to display this?
Yeah, so great question. So number one, SolarGraph won't know if the entire system meets the 40% hurdle or not. So we're going to leave it to you as the designer to say, look, I know I'm using SKUs from Enphase and others that get me to 40%. So right now, the amount of ITC you claim is a manual field in SolarGraph, so you can put that in as 30%, you can override it and say it's 40%. What we're working on within SolarGraph is to have the extra 10% be a toggle. So the 30% can be flat, and you can toggle on and off if you want that extra 10% to show up or not. But right now you can do it, but you have to go in and manually override the 30% to type in 40%, and then go back to 30% for a non-domestic one. But we are working on that extra 10% to be a toggle within SolarGraph.
Okay, question from Kevin came in about ballasted systems. Ballasted systems are not, they're a little bit different in the way that they're attached compared to rails. Could you comment on that, Chris?
So ballast is not an identified project component in the current guidance. So I can tell you that. Beyond that, whatever other type of racking system you're using, I would say you still have to go by those other types of racking subcomponent qualifications, because ballast by itself is not listed as either a subcomponent of a racking system or as an individual component by itself. So for those of you doing a lot of commercial rooftops with ballasted systems, great question.
Yeah, a good one for the actual manufacturers, I would say.
Yeah.
So a couple more questions about how people not quite understanding the math. For example, I've been told that it's the percentage of overall cost of the solar components of the system. How are you just adding the percentages together to get to the 40% level? The math doesn't work out by adding percentages together.
Yeah,
I think there's probably confusion between the amount of the tax credit and the amount of the domestic content to qualify.
Yeah, so there's two parts to this. One is the old guidance prior to May 16th, you had to know what the cost of the components were. So it's correct to be confusing going, how do I add the cost together and how do I add the percentage together and how do you do that? It is very confusing, right? Because prior to May 16th, the only way you could try and do the calculation was I got to add up the cost of all of my subcomponents. The reason we like the updated guidance that came out on May 16th, they're just saying, forget about what your costs were. As long as the component itself meets substantial transformation as domestic content, don't worry about the cost. You get to claim these certain percentages that you can then add up and see if your system gets to 40%. That's why we like the guidance a lot better. It's a lot cleaner. You don't have to worry about what the cost is. And manufacturers like us don't have to game the system to say, well, the part of the component that was US made has a really, really high cost structure. And the international piece, that was really cheap. Don't worry about it. It was too easy to game the system from a cost standpoint, which is why they went to this percentage qualification basis.
All right, we're pretty close to the top of the hour, so we'll do another couple of questions here and then we'll wrap up. And as I mentioned, if your question wasn't answered, don't worry. The questions are going to be kind of disseminated to the right people at Enphase, and you'll get a response by email within a day or two. So please be patient for that. A couple questions about if Enphase is going to make commercial microinverters and other voltages like 480 volt. It sounds like those asking the questions probably already know that the IQ8P 3P is a native 208 volt three-phase system. It can be compatible with other building voltages or electrical service voltages with transformers. For those questions, I recommend talking to your RSM and your FAE or field application engineer from Enphase. Give them some of the project specifics, as much as you know about the building's electrical system, and they'll be able to tell you if the Enphase system can work in that scenario, okay? Is the pricing expected to remain the same for the DOM variations, DOM? I have to admit, I'm not really sure what that acronym stands for. Do you know, Chris?
Yeah, so DOM means domestic content SKU,
okay.
right?
Okay.
So that's what it means. So it's a great question. We get asked this a lot. The question is, hey, Enphase, are you going to charge so much more for that SKU that it's not worth my using it to pick up the extra 10% adder, right? That's the question, and it's a legitimate question. So I'm going to answer it this way: it costs us more to make things in the U.S., right, than it does overseas naturally. So anything with a DOM SKU, because it's only made in the US, is going to reflect that price differential of what it costs us to make it in the US, right? So yes, if you see the DOM SKU, it's going to be more expensive than other SKUs. Like if you're buying the HC today, you will see a price adjustment, but it's related to us having to manufacture that in the US and the overhead for the compliance and stuff to do that. But we're not trying to say, hey, great, we're going to keep 90% of the benefit you're going to get for domestic content because we're the one that made it, right? If you can't claim the benefit, if it's not beneficial, then why are we putting all this time and effort into it? So the short answer is yes, everybody's going to have to cover off their extra costs to manage this program, but we need to make sure we leave enough value so everybody can participate in it.
Chris, a few people have asked about the reliance letter itself. Is that something that we can share in a follow-up email to everybody?
Yeah, ask your RSM and we can make that available to you, right?
Okay.
So ask your RSM and your RSM will run that through our process to get you the reliance letter.
And a question from Veronica, is the IQ8 HC DOM domestic version available now? So yeah, we had that slide up earlier. And the IQ8HC, I mean, there's a SKU number in the slides that we're going to share with you. That is the domestic content version that is already available today.
Yeah, the 17.6% version is available today. That's not the DOM SKU. That's the regular HC SKU we have today.
Okay,
the DOM SKU with the 35% will be available in September. Okay, so again, we're encouraging all installers to coordinate with their distribution partner to try and get the demand signals in, right? Because again, quite honestly, we don't know if this is going to be a yawn, or we don't know if it's like everybody in the world is going to want the HC DOM. Like, that's why we're trying to do this education sooner than later, to try and give you time to do your demand planning, to get those demand signals to your distribution partner, and then to have your distribution partner obviously give us those signals as well, so we can figure out like how much of this particular SKU we need to make and supply it properly.
All right, well, that was a very comprehensive webinar, I think. We had a lot of fantastic questions, and hopefully we're able to answer them satisfactorily for everybody. Again, this is going to be something you'll probably come up with questions about tomorrow or the next day after you absorb the information. Again, we encourage you to reach out to your Enphase RSM. They should be able to answer your questions or direct you to somebody else at Enphase who can. Thank you very much for taking part of your day to join us and learn about this. And we hope you are excited as we are about, putting this plan into action and taking advantage of this additional bonus adder. There's something in it for everybody, right? All right, thank you, Chris. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.